Alright, hello and welcome to this review of that one. The Callisto Protocol is a narrative-driven third-person horror action game, clearly influenced by both the gameplay and overall character of the Dead Space franchise. Really, the inspiration is tangible. It even has the loot stomp! Yay! This admittedly shouldn't be surprising, considering the game's director was the creator of the original Dead Space game. Now, since I'm a sucker for designation, I want to give just a small elaboration for the denomination narrative-driven. This is not the same as story-focused and has nothing to do with visual novels. Narrative-driven simply means that the game and the actions performed are strongly driven by and intertwined with the game's narrative, meaning the story is a core part of the game's goal and completion. This is, at least presently, the norm for core games. It was a little different back in the days, but some good examples of narrative-driven games are Dead Space, Mass Effect, The Last of Us, Uncharted, etc, etc. Games that wouldn't typically be classified as narrative-driven are games where more than like 50% of the players would say the story is more or less irrelevant or functionally inconsequential to the experience. So this would include most roguelike games, many older shooters, basically all arcade games, any track-based racing games or arena-based shooters, many casual games, several sandbox games, and a few other genres. Concrete examples of games would include, among others, The Binding of Isaac, Pac-Man, Risk of Rain, Gran Turismo, Space Invaders, Nuclear Throne, Bejeweled, Froggers, Farmville, Doom 1 and 2, Duke Nukem 3D, The Hunter Call of the Wild, Minecraft, Player. Either way, basically, if half the players don't know the story of the game, it's probably not narrative-driven. That is, know the story of the game. Doesn't mean they have to understand it. Either way, with that said, the game itself is developed by Striking Distance Studios and published by Krafton Incorporated. Or Krafton Inc., rather. It was released in 2022 and is the first game this studio has developed. But enough about that, let's get to actually talking about the game itself. The game delivers a fundamentally linear experience, which is highly directed and makes extensive use of cinematic cutscenes and gameplay sections. The gameplay primarily focuses on its third-person action as well as the horror atmosphere of the game. Aside from that, it doesn't have all that much more to offer. Puzzles are essentially non-existent, exploration is very limited, and I have a hard time seeing resource management as a prominent feature unless perhaps you're playing in hardcore mode. But even there it's of questionable relevance. My inventory was completely filled up almost every single time I got to a crafting station, where all upgrading and resource trading takes place, by the way. The inventory is admittedly rather limited, which is likely to be the most prominent hindrance to you in regards to resource management. That said, not once did I run into what I perceived as a problem in lacking ammo or money. That said though, I tend to be rather conservative with my resources and usually aren't left lacking in loot in general. Since I'm rather fond of exploration, I tend to go through and loot all prominent items in most games I play. That almost always tend to be sufficient as long as you're not spraying away your bullets. Anyways, beyond what's automatically fed to you through story progression, then narrative exploration is limited to a few audio logs per level as well. There isn't any extensive lore or world building going on here. You won't be finding any exhaustive, lengthy or detailed journals, codex entries or text documents. World building and exposition is somewhat limited. Now, the combat is rather mechanically unique, featuring a dodging-focused combat dynamic that integrates firearms through follow-up combo opportunities. You can technically use purely ranged combat if you'd be so inclined, but you'd almost certainly run out of ammo exceedingly quickly, and it's almost invariably an ineffective approach to taking down the majority of enemies, with a few select exceptions. The dodging mechanic, which is a very core part of the combat system, is based on the player's movement direction. A dodge will automatically be performed towards the corresponding move direction if the enemy attacks. Pretty simple and uncomplicated, yet very much a core mechanic of the combat. To avoid the subsequent attack, you then have to dodge towards the direction opposite to the former dodge, or block it by moving backwards. This creates a combat system based around alternating movement direction and counterattacking when appropriate, which is something you will judge from enemy telegraphing. Sometimes they may attack once, sometimes twice, sometimes thrice. It will vary depending on enemy, its health status, as well as random chance. There are also some enemies with other abilities than the standard melee attack. For example, enemies that explode or have the ability to launch projectiles. This means that prioritizing what enemies to take out first is also a core aspect of the game's combat strategy. When attacking, you will sometimes get the opportunity for a follow-up auto-aim ranged quick attack. This attack is, as mentioned, automatically aimed and will often handicap the enemy through dismemberment. This handicap is often expressed through inability to attack more than once in a row, or the inability to use its special ability, such as launching projectiles. There is a decent enough arsenal of ranged weapons, 4 in total, all of which feature a smaller upgrade tree with a alternate fire mode at the top. While the game is heavily inspired by Dead Space, it doesn't have the same focus on ranged combat, and it also doesn't feature the same dismemberment mechanic. While dismemberment certainly is a feature in the game, it does not play the same critical role here as it did in Dead Space. In this game, it will primarily be a result of the ranged combo attack or a stage in the eventual defeat of your enemy as you beat away at them. This is in contrast to Dead Space, where the ranged weapons are constructed for the purpose of dismemberment specifically. Well, constructed in regards to the game, that is. In the actual lore of the Dead Space game, you're often using construction tools, which is rather interesting in its own right, but unfortunately not that relevant for the current topic. So let's move on. Here, ranged dismemberment is not a core part of the combat strategy, and the dismembered body parts cannot be used as weapons. You can fling enemies around though, which is nice. Which leads us neatly to the last core aspect of the combat, which is the environmental hazards. These can kill both you and your enemies, but they are generally only a danger to you if you're careless. Nevertheless, this is often an efficient way to dispose of your enemies while conserving ammunition. These hazards are with benefit used synergistically with your telekinesis for lethal results, and I'd heartily recommend that you do so. These environmental hazards are not particularly difficult or complex to use, and they essentially always grant instantaneous kill on use, independent of enemy. Not making good use of them would be an utter waste. The melee-focused combat and auto-aimed combo attacks do lend themselves well to controller-based layouts, and the aiming imprecision of controllers when compared to keyboard and mouse is less impactful than it is in third-person shooters where ranged combat is the primary combat method. It works well enough with keyboard and mouse configurations as well, mind. The disparity is just less tangible. And yes, I've tried both control methods. If I'm actually bothering to write a review script, I might as well. It's hardly much more effort. That, and I also had to capture some more footage anyway, since my previous capture seems to have disintegrated somehow. The core combat system unfortunately ends up feeling rather basic and strategically shallow. Additionally, the nature of the melee mechanics presents a dynamic where melee enemies have to stand about waiting while you fight. Otherwise, they would present rather unmanageable situations. Luckily, the ranged enemies very much do and can attack, which adds more importance to the order in which you focus and take out enemies. But at the end of the day, the combat still tend to amount to alternating your movement direction, counter-attacking afterwards, and shooting at certain indicated situations. Such as when the enemy starts a mutation process, at which point you'll have to shoot its tentacles a couple of times to kill it and prevent the process. It is rather unique, which is neat, and I do appreciate it when you try new things and relatively uncommon or unique ideas and concepts get a chance, but that unfortunately doesn't make them inherently great and engaging. While it's sufficiently involved to stay at least moderately engaging for the duration of a playthrough, if still somewhat repetitive, it really isn't a combat system I'm clambering to experience more of in the future unless it's been significantly developed. Another quirk in the combat system is that since your melee attack has a knockback effect, the enemies often end up awkwardly pinned against a wall or into a corner when you fight them. which, while not functionally problematic, looks pretty stupid. Which of course is an outcome that's somewhat unfortunate and undesired. I would say perhaps particularly so for a horror game. As a little aside, there is also a dismemberment mode, which is a bit of a throwback that's closer to the Dead Space combat experience, I suppose. Nevertheless, that obviously isn't the standard main mode. Now, before I move on to the next topic, I want to very quickly mention the upgrades and the economy as well. Each weapon features one upgrade for each stat: damage, recoil, ammo capacity. In addition to this, they also have an alternate fire mode, which is available as the last upgrade. Many of the weapons also include some type of visual alteration to the weapon when you upgrade them. Visual representations of upgrades, enhancements or modifications in games is something I tend to appreciate, and this isn't an exception. I think it's very good that they have this. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. The game is, as mentioned, very much a linear experience, and features levels that offer little in way of voluntary exploration or alternative completion avenues. The extent to which exploration is present amounts to a number of smaller pathways or areas of limited size, which tend to contain loot and occasionally an audio log with some additional narrative context. Essentially, we're looking at hidden resources placed within smaller optional aerial extensions and pathways. The game world itself is rather nicely presented, fittingly atmospheric for an action horror game, and makes good use of SFX like fog and lighting. The areas you get to traverse aren't always the most inspired and vary somewhat in how interesting they are. And I would have preferred to spend more time in outside or semi-outside environments, but I'm pretty sure about half the game plays out in dark underground locales and tunnels. At least that's how it felt. This obviously means there's gonna be a lot of dark underground corridors and areas, which, suffice to say, is a rather moderately interesting setting as far as I'm concerned. But that's obviously personal preference. Maybe I've just played a few too many generic action horror games. For the outside sections, you'll primarily find frozen tundra landscapes and industrial facilities. Similarly limited in way of linearity mind, you won't find any open explorable areas here. All this being said, the game is by no means completely bereft of interesting locales. There are a few places in the game that stand out a bit more. There is, for example, an underground shantytown, and the prison cell complex you start out at in the beginning of the game is pretty striking as well. Visually, that is. You scarcely get to explore any of them to any meaningful extent. On the other hand, this does make it easier to make the world feel more narratively consistent. There aren't any areas I found to feel awkwardly incongruous or arbitrarily diversified in order to force environmental variety, which is always appreciated. More cohesive, less diversified, you can of course appraise that as you wish, but for horror, authenticity rightfully tends to be prioritized. That said, there are some notable over-the-top contraptions, such as a huge meat grinder trap for escaped prisoners, which admittedly could be labeled as somewhat over-the-top and ridiculous, but it was pretty rad, so I won't do that. Yes, I do like Warhammer 40k. It is wondrous, and tacitly inane. Anyways, let's jump on to having a quick mention of the story as well, even though there isn't too much to expound on that front.
Oh, come on!
So when it comes to the story, it basically delivers the standard of what you'd expect from a reasonably competent third-person horror action game. It's not especially inspired or interesting, but neither is it outright bad or obnoxious. It's mostly just rather plain. Viral bioweapon conspiracies, secret shadowy organizations.
I will do what is necessary.
Attempts to control insidious forces that present an evident and present threat to human existence. Yep, it's all there. Sounds pretty similar to Dead Space, don't it?
Tybin built another one.
On this station? Why?
It's powerful alien technology.
Funny that. Must be a coincidence. To give a brief and rough abstract of the story, and not spoil it too much, in summary, it's about a mutagenic virus-type outbreak in the prison complex you get pretty much arbitrarily incarcerated in at the beginning of the game.
Yes, sir. Whatever you say. Grab him too.
After some Bint and her friends cost you to crash your spaceship.
you doing? No! Shit!
Explosive compression cargo bay.
About half the game focuses on the objective of getting off the hellhole prison you're stranded on,
Got it. If we're gonna get out of here, we need a ship, one that you can fly.
and the second half shifts goals to finding out about the conspiracy that seems to be behind the virus.
What's it about?
Answers!
Now, quick spoiler warning for those who cares. I initially didn't intend to talk about spoilers, but I also realized that the story is so simple to sum up and talk about that it essentially just takes 2 minutes anyway, so I might as well. I guess I can put a little annotation for when the spoiler section is over. So the woman who crashed your spaceship is from a planet that had previously been infected by the mutagenic virus that's currently wreaking havoc on the prison population and guards. Which essentially encompasses everybody on this piece of rock, by the way, or prison moon to be specific.
It's a prison moon, Max. They take the security pretty serious.
She had a lead that the virus had been smuggled to her planet and is trying to find out who's behind it.
But records show you made multiple drops right before the incident.
Now, eventually, it is revealed that it is indeed you who had unknowingly done it, because you had been willfully ignorant, not knowing or confirming what you have been smuggling, since ignorance is bliss.
What do you got there? What we got here is none of our business. Now, come on. We got a job to do.
The people behind the virus propagation are the same people that are running the prison facility, and they have been using it to experiment on prisoners to try to understand and control it.
Demonstrated a unique ability to synthesize the biophage, to control it.
Yeah, I heard in the recordings.
Yes, this is all very surprising, I know. I really thought they were the good guys when they arbitrarily imprisoned me and forcefully inserted a chip in my neck. Anyways, you find out the truth, she gets infected, you make amends by finding an antidote, taking down the prison administration, and saving her life by sacrificing your own. I mean, it feels very derivative of Dead Space. It does. It's the same director, it makes sense, but still. It comes off as a bit of a rehash of a very similar central theme and narrative. It even has the same person who you know is actually dead appearing all the time due to a mental incongruity thing. Suffice to say, it's hardly an original or inspired story. There is that one rather predictable plot reveal in the story that likely won't be surprising, but that could be appreciated nonetheless. Other than that, there really isn't that much to mention though. That doesn't actually mean it's bad per se, it's just predictable. It's told competently enough and the narrative delivery isn't bad.
I made a lot of bad decisions back then.
Yeah, well, you were probably just dealt a shitty hand.
No. I was used to blame everyone else. But then I realized this was on me. You can't keep running from what you've done.
It's the story itself that's somewhat uninspired. If you want a rather familiar boilerplate action horror story, it'll pretty much deliver that. It's like Friday the 13th or Transformers. You should more or less know what you're getting at this point. Okay, so let's round this off with some technical stuff for those who are interested in that kind of jazz. The game runs well enough, but it does feel somewhat resource intensive for what it actually delivers. And depending on your hardware specs, you might need to tune down the graphics somewhat to get the desired frame rate. You will see a few pretty severe frame drops during the gameplay footage that showcase this, but do keep in mind that the capture software can exaggerate the issue somewhat. I don't know if it's the particle density, ray tracing or what, but it's rather demanding on the GPU and the performance honestly isn't amazing. For a console port it's decent enough, it has most required options but not much that goes above and beyond. A number of accessibility options are available, which is nice, but it would have been nice to be able to zoom out the camera somewhat, because it is really close to the character. I know this is a horror game trick thing, but it's also obnoxious and I don't give a shit. If you can't make a horror game without a cramped as fuck camera, that's your problem. Not as critical as in first-person games, but in this case it is annoyingly close to the character. While perhaps somewhat unnecessarily demanding, the game does look quite nice, and it makes good use of atmospheric fog, lighting and particle effects to create nice framing and atmosphere. The controls works pretty much equally well on gamepad and keyboard, with no obvious superior control method, even though I personally tend to prefer keyboard. Just in general. That goes for basically all games with few exceptions. such as platformers, fighting games, and certain third-person melee action games, such as Dark Souls. All around, it's a pretty decent, albeit generic, third-person action horror game. It manages to deliver on most things quite competently, but doesn't really try to offer much that's especially innovative, inspiring, or interesting either, in my opinion. The story is competently delivered, but rather bland.
Yeah, well, look, I've been in here half my life. I know this place.
The environmental settings are sometimes pretty cool, but often quite generic. The levels are essentially linear, and since I like exploration, that doesn't earn it any points with me either. The most unique and interesting thing it has going for it is the combat system, which is mechanically solid, but rather repetitive and lackluster in way of depth in my opinion. As for a last little comment here, just for the summary, sound effects and atmosphere are completely fine, and do their job well enough. I just really don't have much to annotate on in that area. So it's not a terrible game, I just find it rather uninteresting. It really depends on what you're looking for. Want a somewhat repetitive, melee-focused Dead Space reimagining? That's pretty much what you got here. Want an innovative, inspired and novel experience? Probably not your best bet, honestly. That's pretty much what I can give you in way of advice and direction though. The rest is up for you to decide and determine. But with nothing more to be said, as per usual, farewell.